Segment 13A, Introduction. When Marcus Aurelius' biological son, Commodus, became emperor in 180 AD, the era of 5 good emperors went right down the toilet. Whether Marcus had anyone better to co-opt as his heir is anyone's guess. Despite the great achievements of the Antonine emperors, the Roman bureaucracy was getting bigger, and the Romans themselves, frankly, were getting a bit complacent. Most worrisome was the increasing barbarian action on Rome's northern and eastern frontiers. The skill with which the Antonines had balanced Rome's military and social needs became all the more evident when an absolute lunatic became emperor. The Severan dynasty, 193 to 235 AD, held the line for a short time by focusing on military needs. But once the Severan dynasty fell, the days of the Pax Romana were over. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD, which followed the end of the Pax Romana, was probably inevitable. The borders were crumbling while the government itself collapsed. As many as 30 men were named imperator during this time, and the empire came very close to imploding. The only cure for what ailed the empire involved dumping the Principate for a totalitarian dictatorship better known as the Dominate. In segment 13B, the Roman imperial military, we take a look at how Augustus's leaner, meaner army worked. Commanded by tested and experienced generals, it served its purpose well when a strong, intelligent princeps led the Roman state. Most of Rome's soldiers by this time were not Roman or even Italian, but this diversity was again a source of strength. Non-citizens who served in the army not only assisted the empire with their service, but the empire assisted them by making them citizens once they were retired. Maintaining the limes, or border area, was crucial to the empire's defenses. Wherever possible, the Romans counted on natural boundaries like rivers, mountains, or deserts to keep the empire safe. But in the wide open spaces, the Romans worked out a combination of fortifications and quick response forces which served well for a long time. That is, as long as Rome could afford to pay its soldiers. In segment 13C, crisis of the 3rd century AD, basically everything goes wrong. Barbarians at the doorstep, imbeciles on the throne, and to top everything off, it seemed to the average Roman pagan in the street that the gods were angry. The Roman armies were often too busy fighting each other to do their job of fending off enemies and holding the limes, or borders. Emperors, it seemed, were a dime a dozen, and even the good emperors found exciting ways to get themselves killed. It got so bad that the government wouldn't even accept its own currency in payment of taxes. Parts of the empire broke off. Other parts were overrun. For the first time since Hannibal had stood at the gates, nearly 5 centuries earlier, Rome was faced with another big-time gut check. Once more, Rome had to be reinvented. This time, the mastermind of the empire's salvation was not a blue-blooded native Roman, but a general who had been born a poor Serbian child named Diocletian. Segment 13D, Roman totalitarianism, reveals the answer to Rome's ills as a top-down totalitarian police-state dictatorship. It's called the Dominate to distinguish it from the Principate, or rule by the first man. The emperor was now Dominus et Deus, master and God, with an elaborate court ritual basically emphasizing him as a god on earth. Diocletian made massive reforms to the military, to the imperial government, and to the economy. Diocletian's biggest reform was the Tetrarchy, a very complicated scheme designed to provide the empire with 4 emperors and a logical means of succession. Although the Tetrarchy failed soon after Diocletian left office, Diocletian's other reforms were enough to buy the empire 2 more centuries of survival in the West, and another 1,200 years of survival in the East. The cost of these reforms, though, was terrific. Personal liberty had died for good. Personal initiative was more dangerous than it was helpful. Even though the borders had stabilized, the Roman people never seemed to regain the pluckiness and the optimism, the faith in Rome's destiny that they had possessed before the crisis of the 3rd century A.D. Segment 13b, the Roman imperial military. Augustus's invention of the Principate determined once and for all the role of Rome's military. As always, the Roman army was responsible for maintaining the Roman world's internal stability and external defense. But since the Principate was a military tyranny disguised as a republic, control of the army meant control of the government. Augustus had to assess the empire's military needs carefully and maintain just the right-sized army. Not too large and expensive, but strong enough and fast enough to do the job well. Most importantly, though, the military had to be completely loyal. After consolidating his power over Rome, Augustus first cut the number of Roman troops from roughly 280,000 to roughly 150,000 elite veterans. These veterans swore an oath of allegiance not to Rome, but to Augustus personally. The core of this army was made up of Italian-born Roman citizens, called legionaries, who served a minimum of 25 years. The legionaries were assisted by auxiliary forces recruited from the provinces, also for a minimum term of 25 years. The Romans fought traditionally as heavy infantry. The auxiliaries fought with different specialties depending on their province of origin. Different provinces provided different forms of specialties. Augustus created a 3rd military branch called the Praetorian Guard to serve as his bodyguard. The Praetorians were paid better than the legionaries and were based near Rome. Their commander, the Praetorian prefect, soon came to play an important role in the Roman government. Tiberius built a barracks for the Praetorians just outside of Rome to make sure that he would have access to them and they to him. As it turned out, the Praetorians had a little too much access to Tiberius. He was murdered by the Praetorian prefect Macro in 37 A.D. Clearly, the Roman army's loyalty had to be earned on a continual basis. Up through the time of the good emperors, the Roman army's loyalty was a near constant. The legionaries were Roman citizens who had volunteered to serve. They received, after their 25 years were up, either land or a sizable bonus. Auxiliary soldiers received only 1/3 of a legionary's pay, but on finishing their service they became Roman citizens. The sons of auxiliaries could and often did serve as legionaries. Again, the old Roman stock was revitalized by diverse peoples from around the empire. Granted, the chances of living towards retirement were about 50%, but still the Roman army was an honored profession and a great place to start. In the field, the Roman legions were usually commanded by capable, reliable ex-consuls personally suggested by the princeps. When the Roman Empire was well led, the legions stayed loyal to the princeps. Nero's disastrous reign showed that poorly treated legions could and would revolt. But the year of 4 emperors was an anomaly. The underpinning of the Pax Romana was a strong, well-led, and well-paid military, personally controlled by the princeps himself. Change for the worse was on the horizon. The Roman Empire had pretty much reached its natural boundaries under Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD. The client states destined to become Roman had been added to the empire. Offensive operations were pretty much through, but the Roman Empire's needs increased. The Romans attacked only against raiding tribes or to find a more favorable place to construct fortifications, and the big task now was to keep the barbarians out. Indeed, defending Rome's border areas, often known collectively as the limes, L-I-M-E-S, or boundary, became the ultimate concern of every emperor. Sometimes incorrectly understood as a series of walls, the nature of the limes depended on the nature of the area itself. Where natural boundaries were available, like the Euphrates River, Rhine River, or the Sahara Desert, the Romans were happy to use the natural boundaries. Where natural boundaries were not available, the limes contained a series, if not always a line, of fortifications. These were built more to keep watch on the border than to defend it. Nearby would be a Roman legionary base, a castrum, or an auxiliary camp, castellum. The first Roman patrol or watchtower garrison to detect a barbarian attack might be defeated, but a suitable force of Romans, usually auxiliaries, could quickly come up to defeat the attackers when needed. The legionaries themselves didn't even have to fight most of the time. But when the legionaries did fight, at least up through the crisis of the 3rd century BC, they were all but invincible. Maintaining the limes required an ever larger military establishment. By Marcus Aurelius's time, the Roman army may have numbered as many as 400,000 men, divided roughly half and half between Roman legionaries and foreign auxiliaries. The majority of soldiers were now recruited from the lower classes in the less Romanized provinces, usually where the legions themselves were stationed. While these new auxiliaries fought well enough, their loyalty to the Roman army was a bit questionable. To them, Rome was a faraway city filled with strange people speaking a foreign language. They no doubt participated in the imperial emperor cult, but they had a much keener sense of their general, their commander's imperium. They no doubt fought under Roman eagle standards, but their hearts were in their native provinces where they served, and not in Italy. If a given army's commander declared himself imperator and made play for control of the whole empire, these soldiers were often quite happy to fight for their general's behalf. On some instances, the armies themselves declared their generals to be imperator. In these cases, the unfortunate general had the choice between leading his troops against the empire or death. As we'll see, this recurrence of the old client army phenomenon would become a recipe for disaster in the 3rd century AD. Later on, during the Dominate, another system of troops called the limitanei and the comitatenses was set up along the limes. The limitanei were lightly armed troops who lived almost on the border and were meant to take the brunt of the barbarian attacks which became more and more frequent as time went on. The comitatenses were the heavily armed striking force based in nearby cities, analogous to the old Roman legions. Both forces fought hard to protect the borders, but the morale of the limitanei, the border troops, was mostly critical. Like the Roman citizen soldiers of the Republic's glory days, they fought for their lives against dangerous neighbors. But unlike the old citizen soldiers, the limitanei had no stake in the Roman government and no chance of advancing themselves through hard work. Like the phenomenon of the client army, the ultimate divide of soldier from civic life would contribute greatly to Rome's troubles. Segment 13C, Crisis of the 3rd Century A.D. Marcus Aurelius, last of the 5 good emperors, died in 180 A.D. The empire had enjoyed a century of enlightened rule and a veritable golden age of prosperity. Rome's future looked bright, but serious problems lay just on the horizon. Up to this point, Rome had risen to and surpassed every challenge. Whether the trouble came from Etruscans or from rampaging client armies, from Asian terrorism or a broken-down republic, Rome always found an answer. But Rome would be hard-pressed to find solutions for the problems of the 3rd century A.D. The Roman economy had essentially come to a halt. Agriculture had reached the point of diminishing returns. Science could not bring the tired farmland back to life, and the army could not conquer any more. The concentration of wealth had moved into the hands of a few, and even these wealthy few were feeling overtaxed by the government's demands. The government became more bloated all the time, even though an empire the size of Rome's was expensive even in the best of times. And now the tax base was dwindling both in the cities and in the countryside. Poor people fled from the cities where they had no work and no charity to the countryside where at least they had a chance to work for food. And worst of all, barbarians were pressing at the borders. Marcus Aurelius had spent most of his reign fighting the Parthians in the east and then the tribes on the Dacian frontier. More invaders were on the way. The Parthian Empire itself had frittered out, only to be replaced around 220 A.D. by the stronger and more aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire. Out in the western half of the empire, Britain once more became a flashpoint. Commodus's accession to the throne made things even worse. It was the one serious blot on Marcus Aurelius's record. But even if Commodus had been a clone of his father or the second coming of Augustus, he wouldn't have made much headway against the problems Rome had. As it was, Commodus was one of the top 5 lunatics to rule the Roman Empire, which is no small achievement. A conspiracy put Commodus out of Rome's misery in 192 A.D. It was helped by the Praetorian prefect. Once again, Rome's future was up in the air. The Roman Senate was in no shape to restore the Republic. Instead, the Praetorian Guard actually auctioned off the empire, more precisely promise of the Praetorian Guard support, to the idiot who bid the most money. This particular idiot was a deluded soul named Didius Julianus, whose reign lasted mere days. At once, a ferocious 3-cornered civil war broke out, the first in more than a century. In Britain, the general Clodius Albinus was declared imperator by his legions. The legions of Syria declared their general Pescennius Niger as imperator. From the Danube frontier came the forces of the third wannabe imperator and eventual winner, Septimius Severus, 193 to 211 A.D. As a soldier, Severus naturally saw Rome's greatest problem as the empire's physical security. Social concerns suffered accordingly. No longer did the emperor see his job as maintaining the salus generis humani, or well-being of the human race. Severus had his hands full, first stomping out Clodius and Niger, and then maintaining the borders. Severus's major contributions were hiking the soldiers' pay and getting more lawyers to run the huge imperial bureaucracy. The Severan dynasty, which he founded, survived him for just about 2 decades, and was better known for its weak males and domineering females than anything else. But at least it maintained the frontiers. When Alexander Severus was murdered by the Praetorian Guard in 235 AD, Rome entered the crisis of the 3rd century. The telltale sign of the crisis of the 3rd century AD was the 30-odd emperors, and some were odd indeed, who claimed the imperator in the half-century before 284, when the Emperor Diocletian restored order for good. Some of these emperors held office 2, 3 at a time. Some of these emperors stunk. Some were actually promising. Most had risen from humble peasant status up to the rank of general and been proclaimed as imperator by their soldiers. And again, when the soldiers proclaimed a man imperator, he had 2 choices: revolution or death. As the Roman generals fought with each other, the Roman frontiers crumbled in all directions. From the north, Gothic tribes invaded Gaul, Spain, and even Italy itself. In the east, the Persians conquered Mesopotamia and Syria. Since the Roman armies in the areas were too weak to do anything about the invaders, the Emperor de Jeu resorted to buying the barbarians off. Sometimes Roman provincial leaders seceded from the Roman Empire, as did Postumus in Gaul, or they even established their own empire, as Odenathus and Zenobia did on the fringes of western Syria. At the same time, plague swept wide areas of the empire, bringing starvation and economic chaos along with it. This made paying the soldiers and buying off the invaders even more problematic, and the economy continued its nosedive. The very richest Romans in the cities dodged their fair share by purchasing tax exemptions, which helped the government in the short run, but destroyed it in the long run. Other new sources of revenue included debasing the coinage, which caused inflation so bad that the government would not accept its own Roman money in payment of Roman taxes. This in turn made the tax burden fall even harder on those who could afford it least. What monies the cities could keep for themselves after paying the central government went for walls and fortifications, not social services. Life in the countryside became worse, as invaders roamed the frontier regions almost at will, and marauders joined them in their roamings. Oddly, the luckiest peasants were those who worked on a latifundium-style farm. Even though they were little better than human farm machinery, at least their employers, that is to say their masters, could afford to protect them from the brigands. This crisis of the 3rd century AD was a bigger gut check for Rome than Hannibal had ever caused. Rome had never been in such dire straits. Some emperors won quick popularity by persecuting the Christian church, which was growing by leaps and bounds in these troubled times. The Christians were blamed for wrecking the Pax Deorum, and the emperors made use of it. Otherwise capable emperors like Valerian, 253 to 260, and Aurelian, 270 to 275, got control of the state only to lose their lives in stupid attempts to take out the Persians. Aurelian was murdered on his way out to fight them, and he got off lightly compared to Valerian. Valerian was taken alive by the Persian Emperor Shapur I. Supposedly, Valerian lived out his days as Shapur's personal footstool, although this could well be an urban legend spread by the Christians, whom Valerian very eagerly persecuted. Regardless of its truth, this footstool anecdote provides a very vivid image of how far Rome's prestige had fallen. No Roman would ever have dared whisper a story like this about Augustus, or Vespasian, or Trajan, or even Septimius Severus. More in one moment. Segment 13D, Roman Totalitarianism. Plagued by civil war, famine, and economic chaos, the Roman Empire was barely hanging on. Slowly the frontiers stabilized, more from lack of outside pressure than from anything the Romans did right. Stronger emperors like Aurelian, 270 to 275 AD, were able to suppress rebellions in Gaul and Syria. Yet the Principate, like the Republic 3 centuries earlier, was basically broken. The Roman Empire was too large, its frontiers too long to be ruled effectively. The government had no time for nice old Republican customs like Senate meetings and annual elections. Citizenship was likewise a thing of the past. If you were wealthy and powerful, this made you one of the honestiores, or the better people, and you told other people what to do. If you got told what to do, you were one of the humiliores, or worse people. You did as told, or else. Ironically, this distinction between the better and the worse citizens echoed the old patrician plebeian divisions of Rome's earliest days. What goes around, comes around. Those Romans who still embraced the mos maiorum blamed the Christians for breaking the pax deorum, or peace of the gods, and blamed them for causing all of the empire's ills. They found the Christian tendency to endure even the harshest persecution very aggravating. The Christians themselves, while not openly opposing the Roman government, still focused less on the secular world, that is, their everyday lives as Romans, and more on their spiritual lives as disciples of Jesus Christ. Into this situation stepped the Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 312 AD. He was born a poor Serbian boy who thought the Roman army would be a great place to start. He rose through the ranks and, like many generals before him, found himself acclaimed as imperator by his troops. Despite his low birth and lack of education, he knew the Roman Empire's political, military, and economic ills. He took bold steps to address them. And the first casualty was the Principate itself. The ruler of the world's largest empire could no longer even pretend to be like Bubacus or Jethro in their 6-story apartment. Diocletian was the first Roman emperor to discard entirely the pretense that Rome was still a republic. Diocletian insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, God and Master. He insisted upon being treated accordingly, complete with a new imperial ritual largely borrowed from the Persians. 3 centuries earlier, Augustus would welcome common Romans to his humble house on the Palatine, dressed in clothes handmade by his wife Livia. But those were different times. Now, the God and Master Diocletian required visitors to crawl into his palace and prostrate themselves before they could kiss the hem of the Lord and Master's gown. No part of Rome's government escaped Diocletian's attention. His every word was an unbreakable law. If you disobeyed him, or thought of disobeying him, or thought of disliking him, you were in big trouble. Diocletian's reform of the Roman government were as totalitarian as could be, thereby well earning this age its name of the Dominate. Diocletian's most important administrative reform was the Tetrarchy, which divided power between two senior emperors called Augusti and two assistant emperors called Caesars, bringing a grand total to 4. One Augustus ruled the Western Empire, and one Augustus ruled the Eastern Empire. Each Augustus was assisted by his own personal Caesar. The Caesar was also the Augustus's adopted son and designated successor. Each of the 4 emperors had his own capital and his own court, close to the hot spots on the Roman frontier, which excluded, by the way, Rome herself. The plan was that the Augusti would retire at the same time. Each would be replaced by his Caesar. The 2 new Augusti would each pick a new Caesar, and the Tetrarchy would just keep rolling along, in theory. The Tetrarchy was a well-intentioned attempt to divide the ruling responsibility of the empire. It was an attempt to ensure the succession of qualified emperors. As long as Diocletian himself was one of the Augusti, it worked well. But the plan was far too complicated to survive his retirement. The Tetrarchy's only lasting effect was foreshadowing the ultimate division of the Roman world into Eastern and Western empires. Finally, Diocletian wanted the economy to support his approach to government. He first tried to reform currency, and that didn't work. He next fixed wages and prices on pain of death. This also failed. Finally, he wound up taxing the masses in labor, in money, and by taking their possessions. Landowners and tradesmen were obliged to stay in their livelihoods, so they could not escape their share of the tax burden. In that regard, at least, Diocletian was an equal opportunity tyrant. The elaborate economic rules and regulations was overseen by a bloated, expensive bureaucracy, locking the government into a vicious circle and marking the first step of Western society into feudalism. The bureaucracy also was responsible for governing the dioceses, each of which was made up of several provinces. Instead of letting the major cities of a region rule the surrounding countryside, everybody was responsible to the diocesan vicar appointed by Diocletian. Needless to say, this vicar put his God and master's best interests ahead, regardless of what it meant for Rome or the Roman people. The layers upon layers of bureaucracy added nothing to the tax revenues, and even less to the security of the empire. Perhaps Diocletian slept better at night knowing that no one of this army of stylus pushers would ever get big enough to take him down. Centuries later, a Russian named Joseph Stalin would take the same iron-fisted approach in building up and defending a land called the Soviet Union. In sum, Diocletian's invention of the Dominate made sure the Roman Empire could have 2 more centuries of security. But Rome's temporary internal and external stability came at a painful price. For rich and poor alike, personal initiative was now pointless, only adding to the residual sense of despair or malaise from the crisis of the 3rd century. The once vibrant cities of the empire were now ghost towns. The fields, which once abounded in citizen soldiers, were now worked by beaten-up peasants who were basically serfs. Everything was controlled by a huge, soulless, all-powerful bureaucracy, answerable only to someone with the job title God and Master. Everybody knew that the Roman Empire was having the life squeezed out of it, but nobody dared mention it for fear of Diocletian's spies. Better, perhaps, the evil the Romans knew than the prospect of being overrun from the north, barbarians from the north or the east or the south. But I ask you this, were secure frontiers and a functioning economy really worth the collection and creation of a police state? Something to think about. Segment 13E, Conclusions. 1. All quiet on the limes. The Roman military had always been the key to the Principate's security, and therefore to the Pax Romana. Therefore, the limes, or boundary area of Rome, became a higher and higher priority. The Roman Empire was not and could not be a big fortified camp. Wherever possible, the Romans counted on natural boundaries to defend them, such as rivers or deserts or mountains. Still, massive amounts of men and money were required to keep things safe all along the limes. There was no guarantee that the soldiers or their generals would remain loyal. Julius Caesar had started his rise to glory commanding a client army on the Gallic frontier. During the time of the 5 good emperors, the limes was fairly quiet. It was well governed, and there was a shortage of barbarians. Marcus Aurelius's wars on the Danube gave a dangerous foretaste, though, of Rome's future. The barbarians got knocked down, but they got up again. 2. National gut check. The dynasty of Septimius Severus, which ruled from 193 AD to 235 AD, kept Rome's impending crisis at arm's length. Severus's personal contribution was to all but trash the Principate. The Republican form still existed, but Severus worked around them. Severus was more concerned with keeping his army paid and trained. So much for the salus genus humani, or common good of humankind. The Roman safety net rotted away, but Severus assumed, no doubt rightly, that the salus generis humani wouldn't be worth much with barbarians traipsing along the roads of the inner empire. Nor would it be worth much with Roman armies traipsing along the same roads to install their own commanders as imperator. The government crumbled so badly that it wouldn't even accept its own coinage in payment of taxes. The world's greatest superpower had gone back to a barter economy. This national gut check made Hannibal at the doors look like a trick-or-treater. 3. Blame the Christians. Not that the Christians, or anyone else for that matter, deserve to be persecuted, of course. But in times as wretched as those, during the crisis of the 3rd century AD, it was almost understandable. As the second coming of Jesus Christ seemed less and less imminent, the Christians had to organize their faith or else. But the Christian message itself never did change. The current world, the secular world, with its Caesars and its civil wars, was only passing, a rehearsal for the eternal heavenly life to come in the future following the second coming. Not only was this message especially attractive in especially difficult times, the Christian church actually had a very good track record for meeting the physical needs of the less fortunate among them. Consequently, the Christian church provoked 2 drastically different reactions during these times. Either wholehearted acceptance, sign me up, or desperate fury at this offense against the mos maiorum and the Roman gods. 4. Cult of personality. The cult of the emperor's personality had always been a crucial part of the Principate. The princeps was worshipped as a god in the eastern parts of the empire, and he was a subject of much great poetry and art devoted to his wonderful nature. But the good old Mos Maiorum would never have accepted, in Augustus's time, a princeps who called himself a living god among the Romans. Yet, the crisis of the 3rd century had so crippled the Roman world that the elaborate pretenses of the Principate were no longer necessary. Sadly, Rome was ready to move from disguised tyranny to open tyranny. What mattered most by Diocletian's time was security at any cost. As long as the Roman world was ruled by a man, any man could challenge him. But if it was ruled by a god, or so Diocletian believed, men might be more afraid to challenge him. This was not the same sort of god as promoted by the emperor cult during the Principate. Diocletian adorned his self-appointed divinity with a wide range of rituals and rules designed to exalt his status as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. Even his Christian successors, after dropping the God part, of course, retained the rituals and passed them down through the Byzantines, down through the Russians, down through the British, down to our very day.